The human child's hand slipped from Commander Kale's grasp during the station evacuation, and in the chaos of screaming alarms and fleeing crowds, she vanished into a restricted corridor marked with Gentar script. Kale's blood ran cold. That corridor led to the royal chambers. The Gentar Empire didn't negotiate, didn't forgive trespass, and their princess was visiting this orbital station for the first time in her life. Protocol demanded he report the breach immediately. Survival instinct told him to retrieve the child first and pray no one noticed. He had 5 minutes before the delegation's security sweep would detect her biosignature in a forbidden zone. The corridor stretched before him, its walls lined with energy barriers that shimmered like oil on water. Each one required clearance he didn't possess, but the child had somehow slipped through spaces meant to be impenetrable. He found her 30 seconds later standing in an atrium filled with living crystal formations that pulsed with bioluminescent light. She couldn't have been more than 6 years old, her refugee clothing torn and stained from weeks in the station's lower levels. She stood perfectly still, transfixed by the crystalline garden that served as the Gentar royal family's meditation space. Princess Velshara emerged from behind a towering crystal spire, her forearms folded in a gesture Kale recognized as supreme displeasure. She stood 9 feet tall, her chitinous exoskeleton gleaming midnight blue under the garden's strange light. Her compound eyes fixed on the child with an intensity that made Kale's hand move instinctively toward his sidearm, though he knew the futility of that gesture. One princess, one child, one guard who'd failed his duty. The mathematics of this disaster unfolded in his mind with crystalline clarity. Velashara's mandibles clicked in a pattern that Kale's translator chip rendered as low, dangerous laughter. "Human," she said, her voice carrying harmonics that human ears weren't designed to process. "Your spawn has violated sacred space. Do you comprehend the sentence this demands?" The child turned toward Velshara, and Kale saw something in her expression that froze his breath. Not fear, recognition. The girl raised one small hand and spoke in flawless Gentar, using a dialect so ancient that Kale's translator struggled to render it. "The gardens remember," the child said. "The crystals sing of the choosing." Velshara's forearms unfolded slowly. The temperature in the atrium dropped 10 degrees. Kale stepped forward, positioning himself between the princess and the child, knowing the gesture was theatrical at best, suicidal at worst. "Your radiance," he began, using the formal address his briefing had drilled into him. "The child is displaced, traumatized. She doesn't understand. She understands perfectly." Velshara moved with liquid grace, circling them both. "She speaks the dead tongue. She knows the forbidden words." "How?" The child's hand found Kale's again, but her eyes never left the princess. "My mother sang them. Before the fire. Before the ships came. She sang about gardens that choose and queens who answer." Kale felt the shift in the room's energy like a physical blow. Velashara stopped moving. Her exoskeleton darkened to pure black, a color change that Kale's briefing materials had mentioned only once, in a section marked with 17 different security warnings. It meant the princess had entered a state called Velkarith, the killing calm. "Your mother," Velshara whispered, "was Gentar?" The child shook her head. "Human. But she studied the old ways. She said the songs were dying and someone should remember. She said gardens don't care about species, they care about who listens." Velshara's mandibles opened fully, revealing the phosphorescent interior of her feeding cavity. In any other species, Kale would have called it a smile. In a Gentar royal, it meant something far more complex, far more dangerous. "You will not last," Velshara said, the words carrying the weight of prophecy and promise combined. "The gardens test those who enter. Even my kind fail. A human child speaking dead words she doesn't understand will not survive the choosing." Kale's mind raced through every regulation, every protocol, every desperate option. He could try to extract the child by force, but Velshara would cut them down before they reached the corridor. He could call for backup, but that would escalate this into an interstellar incident that would end with war. He could... The child released his hand and walked deeper into the garden. Kale lunged after her, but Velshara's middle arm extended with serpentine speed, blocking his path without touching him. "The child has chosen," the princess said. "You cannot interfere. Even I cannot interfere. The gardens are older than our empire, older than your species' first thoughts. They accept whom they wish, and they destroy whom they will. Your spawn has invoked the ancient right. She will face the choosing, or she will be marked as craven for all time." Kale watched the child walk between crystal formations that began to pulse with increasing intensity. The light changed colors, moving through spectrum ranges that human eyes registered as pain rather than vision. The child didn't flinch. She moved with purpose, with certainty, following a path that seemed to open before her as the crystals themselves shifted and parted. "What is the choosing?" Kale demanded. Velshara's voice carried something he'd never expected to hear from a Gentar royal. Uncertainty. A test. A judgment. A gift. The gardens show you what you are, what you could be, what you would sacrifice. Those who pass become Velmora, chosen of the depths. Those who fail, she didn't finish. The child reached the garden's center, where a crystal formation rose from the floor like a frozen fountain. She placed both hands on its surface. The entire atrium blazed with light so intense that Kale's vision whited out. When it cleared, the child stood unchanged, but the crystal beneath her hands had transformed. Where it had been clear, it now swirled with colors that matched human neural patterns: warm gold, soft ambers, living warmth, and a structure designed for cold perfection. Velshara made a sound that Kale's translator couldn't process at all. The princess sank to her knees, all four arms spread wide in a gesture that looked like surrender. The child turned toward them, and Kale saw that her eyes had changed. Not physically, but in the way she held herself, the weight of presence she now carried. "The queen is coming," the child said, still speaking that ancient dialect. "The gardens have called, and she will answer. She said I would not last." She was right. What I was cannot survive what the gardens have shown me. Velshara rose slowly, her exoskeleton shifting through colors Kale had no names for. "You speak madness. Queen Zelvara does not come to orbital stations. Just not leave the throne world. The gardens cannot summon—" The atrium's walls began to vibrate. Kale felt it in his bones, a frequency that bypassed his ears entirely and spoke directly to something primal in his nervous system. Every crystal in the garden resonated in harmony, creating a sound that was also a light, also a presence, also a judgment. Princess Velshara's mandibles clicked in rapid patterns that Kale's translator rendered as prayer. The child stood at the garden's center, hands still touching the transformed crystal, and smiled with a wisdom no 6-year-old should possess. "She's already here," the child whispered. "She never left." That's what my mother's songs were trying to tell anyone who would listen. The gardens don't choose who enters. They reveal who was chosen all along. The door to the atrium opened without sound, without ceremony, without warning. Commander Kale turned to face whatever had arrived, his hands still hovering uselessly near his sidearm, his mind struggling to process the impossible geometry of what was unfolding around him. The child who should have died in the evacuation. The princess who should have killed them both. The gardens that should have remained legend. The queen who could not possibly have come. But the child had spoken truth. What she was could not survive what she was becoming. The gardens had indeed chosen. And in the doorway stood a figure that made Velshara's 9 feet seem insignificant, whose exoskeleton gleamed with the accumulated colors of 10,000 choices, whose presence filled the atrium with authority that transcended species, transcended time, transcended every law that Kale had believed governed the universe. Queen Zelvara had come. And the child at the garden center, the human child who'd spoken the dead tongue and touched the choosing crystal, stood waiting with eyes that no longer held fear, no longer held confusion, no longer held the simple light of human childhood. She had become something else entirely, something the gardens had recognized, something even a queen would answer. The evacuation alarms still screamed in distant corridors. Refugees still fled toward transport ships. The orbital station still balanced on the edge of catastrophic failure. But in this atrium, in this moment, the only thing that mattered was the choice that had already been made, the answer that had already been given, the future that crystallized into certainty with every pulse of bioluminescent light. Queen Zelvara moved forward, and her first words would determine whether this moment birthed alliance or apocalypse. The child waited. Velashara prostrated herself fully. Kale stood witness to something he couldn't name, couldn't understand, couldn't escape, and the garden sang in frequencies that hadn't been heard in 10,000 years, calling home those who had always been chosen, demanding price from those who'd boasted without understanding, offering death to those who would accept transformation. The child had been right. She would not last. But what emerged from the choosing would shake empires. Queen Zelvara's voice resonated through the atrium like tectonic plates grinding into alignment. "Speak your name, child of distant earth, singer of forgotten songs, vessel of the Velmora." The little girl's voice remained small, fragile, utterly human, yet it carried through the crystalline space without effort. My mother called me Maya. The gardens call me something else, something I don't have words for yet. The queen moved closer, her 12 feet of height casting shadows that seemed to bend light rather than block it. Her exoskeleton bore markings that Kale's briefing materials had never mentioned, patterns that shifted and reformed with each step, as if her very body was in constant dialogue with the universe itself. Your mother was wise to teach you the old songs. Foolish to believe they were merely history. Exelvera's compound eyes fixed on the child with an intensity that made Velshara's earlier rage seem gentle by comparison. Do you know what you have done, small one? Do you comprehend the price the gardens demand from those who accept their choosing? Maya's hands remained on the crystal. They showed me every possibility, every path, every version of myself that could exist if I make different choices. Her voice cracked, revealing the frightened child beneath the impossible wisdom. They showed me dying alone in the evacuation. They showed me living scared forever. They showed me becoming someone who helps end the war between our people. She looked up at the queen, tears cutting tracks through the grime on her face. They showed me you, choosing death over dishonor, choosing sacrifice over survival. They said you would understand. Kale felt rather than saw Velshara flinch. The princess remained prostrate, but her exoskeleton color shifted to pale amber, a shade his briefing materials identified as mourning. Queen Exelvera stood perfectly still. When she spoke again, her voice carried harmonics that Kale's translator chip rendered as grief layered over fury, layered over something close to hope. The gardens never lie, but they are cruel in their truth-telling. The queen's 4 primary arms unfolded, her secondary manipulator limbs extending to their full span. Princess Velshara, rise. Explain how this child penetrated 17 security protocols to reach forbidden space. Velshara rose with liquid grace, her body language screaming apology and confusion in equal measure. My queen, I take full responsibility. I should have eliminated the breach immediately. You should have recognized the garden's call when you heard it, Zelvera interrupted, as I did halfway across the sector, when every crystal in the throne world began singing in unison for the first time in 3,000 years. The queen's mandibles clicked in a pattern that Kale's translator struggled to render, finally settling on sardonic amusement. You boasted she would not last. You were correct. The child who entered this garden no longer exists. What stands before us now is Velmora, chosen, changed, consecrated by truth that would shatter lesser minds. Maya's small body trembled. I don't feel consecrated. I feel scared. The gardens showed me what needs to happen. They showed me what you have to do, what you've already decided to do. She looked directly at the queen with eyes that held knowledge no evacuation, no trauma, no childhood experience could have granted. You're going to die. You chose it already. You chose it before I even touched the crystal. The gardens just made me remember what I was always supposed to know. The temperature in the atrium plummeted. Kale saw frost forming on his breath. Velshara's exoskeleton flushed deep purple, the color of shock bordering on system collapse. Queen Zelvara moved with speed that defied her size, crossing the space between herself and the child in a single fluid motion. She towered over Maya, her presence overwhelming, her power absolute. Kale's hand finally found his sidearm. Knowing the weapon was useless, knowing he would fire it anyway if the queen threatened the child. But Zelvara didn't strike. Instead, she lowered herself until her compound eyes were level with Maya's human gaze. The gardens showed you the Velkarith Protocol. Not a question. A statement weighted with centuries of history Kale didn't understand. Yes, Maya whispered. The choosing where a leader sacrifices herself to save those who would be destroyed in retaliation for her people's actions. You're going to take blame for the colony massacre even though your military commanders acted without authorization. You're going to accept execution to prevent the full-scale war that would kill billions. Velshara made a sound like shattering glass. No, my queen, no. The commanders will be executed. We have evidence of their treachery. The Human Alliance will accept nothing less than blood that matters, Zelvara said, her voice gentle despite the word's brutality. 14,000 colonists dead. Children. Elders. Non-combatants slaughtered by weapons that bore my seal, fired from ships under my command by officers wearing my colors. The Alliance demands proportional justice. A queen's life for a colony's death. This is the price of preventing total war. Kale found his voice, though it emerged raw and broken. Our people wouldn't demand that. We wouldn't ask for... Your alliance already has, the Queen interrupted, finally turning her attention to him fully. 3 hours ago, through channels your commander didn't have clearance to access. The formal demand was delivered with proof of their capability to sterilize 17 of our colony worlds before our fleets could respond. They framed it as justice. They meant it as deterrence. They are correct that my death would satisfy honor on both sides and prevent the extinction-level conflict my commander's actions have precipitated. She returned her focus to Maya. But you knew this. The gardens showed you the future that branches from my choice. Tell me, small Velmora, what else did they reveal? Maya's hands finally left the crystal. The moment contact broke, she collapsed to her knees, her body remembering it was 6 years old, traumatized, exhausted beyond measure. Kale moved instinctively to catch her, but Zelvara was faster, her secondary arms supporting the child with surprising gentleness. They showed me the war if you don't do it, Maya said, her voice small again, fragile again, breaking apart under the weight of visions no child should carry. Millions dead, planets burning. Both our species reduced to hatred that lasts generations. They showed me you walking to your execution with honor, and how that single act becomes the foundation for peace. Tears streamed freely now, but they also showed me something else, something the gardens said I needed to tell you. Something about choice and cycles and breaking patterns that have governed your people since before humans built our first ships. She looked up at the Queen who held her, this massive alien sovereign who had crossed half the sector because crystals sang a summons. They showed me that you don't have to die, but it requires you to do something no Gentar Queen has done in recorded history. Velshara stepped closer, her exoskeleton shifting through colors that indicated confusion, hope, and terror cycling too rapidly to distinguish. My Queen. The child speaks from trauma. The gardens often show multiple futures. It doesn't mean silence. Zelvara's command cut through the atrium like a blade. The Velmora speaks truth. The gardens do not choose vessels lightly. If they showed her an alternative path, it exists. Whether I possess the courage to walk it is another matter entirely. She adjusted her grip on Maya, cradling the exhausted child against her armored thorax. Speak, small one. Tell me what the gardens showed you. Tell me what I must do that has never been done. Maya's eyes were closing despite her efforts to stay conscious. You have to kneel, not to humans, to the truth. You have to tell both our peoples that you were wrong, that the system that allowed unauthorized genocide is broken. That being queen doesn't mean being infallible. Her voice faded to barely audible. You have to show them that power and accountability can exist together, that strength includes admitting failure. That leadership means protecting those who would be destroyed by your pride. She managed to focus on Zelvera's compound eyes one final time. You have to choose transformation over death. You have to let what you are end so something better can begin, just like I did when I touched the crystal, just like the gardens demand from everyone they choose. The child went limp in the Queen's arms, unconscious from exhaustion and the weight of visions that would have broken most adults. Zelvara stood slowly, holding Maya with a care that seemed at odds with her species' reputation for ruthless efficiency. Commander Kale, the Queen said, her voice formal, controlled, revealing nothing of what computations ran behind her eyes. Your protocol regarding this breach? Kale's mind raced through regulations that seemed meaningless in the face of what he'd witnessed. I should report unauthorized access to restricted space. I should file charges against the child for violation of diplomatic sanctuary. I should recommend both our removals from duty for failure to maintain security. He paused, then abandoned protocol entirely. But the child is 6 years old, traumatized and apparently chosen by gardens I don't understand for purposes I can't comprehend. So I'm going to do what actually makes sense. I'm going to request medical attention for her, protective custody until her family can be located, and an emergency session with your delegation because apparently we're on the edge of a war that could have been prevented if anyone had bothered to listen to a refugee child singing songs her mother taught her. Zelvara's mandibles spread in what might have been approval. You break protocol effectively. This is promising. She turned to Velshara. Princess. You boasted the child would not last. You were correct, though not in the way you intended. What stands before us is transformed, chosen, marked by forces that predate our empires. The question now is whether we possess the wisdom to hear what the gardens are telling us through her. Velshara's exoskeleton had settled into deep gray, the color of contemplation and reassessment. My queen, if what the child says is true, if there is an alternative to Velkareth, I beg you to consider it. Your death would satisfy honor, yes, but your life, spent rebuilding trust and accountability, could accomplish far more. Zelvera moved toward the atrium's exit, still carrying Maya's unconscious form. The gardens showed her possibilities, not certainties. The path she described requires me to do what no queen has done: publicly acknowledge systemic failure, accept personal responsibility without death, and trust that both our species possess wisdom enough to accept transformation over simple vengeance. She paused at the threshold, her massive form silhouetted against the corridor's harsh lighting. I am not convinced I have such courage. Death is simple, clean, final. What she describes is complex, uncertain, requiring me to live with consequences rather than escape them through honorable sacrifice. She looked down at the child in her arms, but this small one touched the choosing crystal and survived what breaks trained warriors. She accepted transformation when she could have fled. She carries visions that would shatter most minds, yet she spoke truth to a queen who could have killed her with a thought. Excelvera's voice softened. If a 6-year-old human child possesses such courage, perhaps I should find some fraction of it within myself. Kale followed as the queen moved into the corridor, Velshara falling into step beside him. Security klaxons still wailed in distant sections. The station still balanced on the edge of evacuation failure, but something fundamental had shifted in the atrium. Some possibility that hadn't existed before a traumatized child stumbled into forbidden space and spoke words that summoned a queen across the void. What happens now? Kale asked, the question emerging before he could consider whether speaking to the queen so directly was wise. Zelvera didn't slow her pace. Now I contact the Human Alliance. I tell them what transpired here. I offer them a choice they didn't know existed: my death through Velkareth, which satisfies honor and achieves peace through blood, or my life spent dismantling the systems that enabled massacre, which is harder, slower, and requires both our peoples to accept that justice can exist without execution. She adjusted Maya's position, ensuring the child's breathing remained steady. I suspect they will choose death. Humans are pragmatic, vengeful, understandably so. A queen's execution would be clean, proportional, final. Why accept the uncertainty of transformation when blood would suffice? Velshara spoke carefully. And if they choose your life, if they accept the harder path, then I will spend whatever years remain to me proving the child's vision was worth preserving, Zelvera said. I will dismantle command structures that enabled unauthorized genocide. I will establish accountability mechanisms that prevent future atrocities. I will work toward the kind of alliance the Gardens showed this child. Difficult, imperfect, but built on something more durable than fear. She looked at Velshara directly. And you, Princess, will help me. You who boasted she would not last. You who witnessed her transformation. You who now understand that strength without wisdom is merely violence delayed. They reached the medical bay where station personnel scrambled to prepare for the evacuation's casualties, as Zelvera handed Maya to a human doctor with unexpected gentleness. This child is Velmora, chosen by forces older than our conflicts. She requires protection, care, and, when she wakes, someone who will listen to what the Garden showed her with full seriousness. The doctor, a woman whose name tag read Chen, looked between the massive Gentar queen and the unconscious child with visible confusion.
What happened to her?
She survived transformation that destroys trained adults. She carries visions that could reshape the relationship between our species, if we possess courage enough to listen. The queen straightened to her full height. I am returning to my delegation. In 1 hour, I will transmit a message to the Human Alliance. In that message, I will offer them a choice that may determine whether our species build peace or burn in mutual extinction. The child's survival may have saved billions, or doomed them. We will know soon enough. She turned to Kale. Commander, you acted outside protocol to protect one small life. This is noted. When systems are rebuilt, when accountability mechanisms are established, the humans will need liaisons who understand that rules serve people, not the reverse. Remember this moment. Remember the choice you made when protocol demanded one action and wisdom suggested another. Kale watched the queen depart, Velshara following, 2 steps behind in the traditional guard position. The medical bay buzzed with activity around Maya's unconscious form. Scanners and monitors confirming what Kale already knew. Physically, she was unharmed. Whatever the gardens had done to her left no biological trace, only the weight in her eyes that he'd seen before she collapsed, the weight of someone who had looked at all possible futures and chosen the hardest path available. Dr. Chen finished her preliminary scan. She's stable. Exhausted, but healthy. Some malnutrition from time in the refugee sections, minor dehydration, nothing we can't correct. She hesitated. Commander, what did the Queen mean about transformation? What happened in that atrium?
Kale had no answer that wouldn't sound
A child spoke ancient words to a princess who wanted her dead. The princess said she wouldn't last.
A queen crossed the void because crystals sang.
The child touched something that showed her all possible futures and survived knowledge that should have shattered her mind. That same child now held information that could prevent a war or guarantee one depending on choices yet unmade. I don't know, he said finally, opting for honesty over comprehension, but I think we just witnessed something that doesn't happen very often. Maybe something that hasn't happened in thousands of years. And now we wait to see if it mattered. Maya stirred on the medical bed, her eyes opening slowly. When she focused on Kale, she smiled with the tiredness that belonged to someone who had lived entire lifetimes in the space between heartbeats. She's going to try, the child said, her voice rough with exhaustion. The Queen. She's going to offer the hard path. She's scared it won't work. Scared she'll fail. Scared both our peoples will choose easy vengeance over difficult transformation. But she's going to try. The child's eyes closed again. The gardens showed me that, too. They showed me her making the choice. They said some people are chosen not because they're special, but because they're willing. Willing to change. Willing to admit they were wrong. Willing to survive when dying would be simpler. She drifted back towards sleep, murmuring words that might have been prophecy or might have been exhaustion. She boasted I wouldn't last. She was right, but neither will she. Neither will anything that exists right now. The gardens choose transformation. They choose change. They choose death of what we are so something better can be born. Maya's breathing deepened into true sleep. Kale stood watching her, this small human child who'd somehow become the fulcrum on which galactic peace balanced. In distant chambers, Queen Zelvara would be composing her message, choosing her words, deciding how to offer transformation to a species that had every right to demand blood. The evacuation alarms finally went silent. Station personnel had managed to repair the critical failures that had triggered the emergency. Refugees would be relocated safely, the immediate crisis had passed, but another crisis loomed. One measured not in structural failures or failing life support, but in the space between vengeance and wisdom, between the clean simplicity of execution and the complicated work of building something new from acknowledged failure. Kale's communicator chirped, "Message from Station Command, priority urgent." He read it twice to be sure he understood. The Human Alliance had received a preliminary communication from Queen Zelvara. They were convening an emergency session. They wanted representatives present who had witnessed the incident that prompted the Queen's unexpected offer. They wanted Commander Kale. And they wanted the child when she was stable enough to speak. The message ended with a single line that made Kale's blood run cold. Alliance leadership is split. Vote could go either way. Prepare to testify regarding the Queen's fitness for alternative justice. What he said in that chamber, what Maya said if she was strong enough to speak, would tip the balance, would determine if Zelvara's courage mattered, would decide if transformation was possible or if the clean simplicity of death would prevail. Kale looked at Maya sleeping on the medical bed, looked at Dr. Chen preparing IV fluids and nutrition supplements, looked at his own hands, which had reached for a sidearm he knew was useless, which had tried to protect a child who didn't need his protection, which had failed at protocol but succeeded at something harder to name. "Doctor," he said quietly, "when she wakes, tell her the Alliance wants to hear what she saw. Tell her she gets to choose whether she's strong enough to speak. Tell her that no one will force her, but that what she says might change everything." Chen nodded slowly. "And if she says she's not ready? If she's too traumatized? Then I testify alone," Kale said. "And I do my best to explain something I don't fully understand. And I hope it's enough." But he suspected it wouldn't be. The Alliance would want to hear from the Velmora herself, from the child who had survived the choosing, from the small human who had looked at all possible futures and told a queen there was a harder path worth taking. In chambers across the station, across the sector, across the spaces where power made decisions that rippled through billions of lives, the choice was being weighed. Death or transformation, simple vengeance or complicated wisdom. The clean ending or the difficult beginning. And at the center of it all, a 6-year-old child who'd stumbled into forbidden space and touched a crystal that revealed what most spend lifetimes avoiding. That change is harder than dying, that transformation requires courage beyond mere sacrifice, that sometimes the greatest act of strength is admitting failure and choosing to survive it. The Gardens had chosen well. The Queen had heard their call. The child had spoken truth. Now came the hardest part, convincing those who held power that the difficult path was worth walking. That transformation mattered more than vengeance, that what the Gardens showed was real, possible, worth the risk of believing. Maya slept on. Zelvera composed her message. The Alliance prepared to vote, and Kale stood witness to a moment that would either birth alliance or guarantee apocalypse, depending on whether anyone possessed courage enough to believe a traumatized child who had touched truth and survived. The evacuation was over. The real test had just begun.